Imagine waking up one morning to find a woman standing at the edge of your property, clipboard in hand, measuring your grass with a ruler. Sounds ridiculous, right? Now imagine that same woman, your nosy, self-appointed HOA queen, escalates from passive-aggressive notes to pulling a gun on you, all because she thinks she can control your land. The craziest part? You're not even in the HOA. This is the insane true story of a power-hungry Karen, a farmer who refused to back down, and the epic downfall that no one saw coming. Buckle up, because this isn't just petty neighborhood drama. This is war. Hello beautiful people. Before we dive in, a small click from you can help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button and be part of the journey. Let's go. It was a peaceful morning on the outskirts of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Birds chirped, the sun shone over neatly trimmed lawns, and the distant hum of a tractor signaled the start of another day. Everything was as it should be until Karen arrived. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, was the kind of person who believed she owned not just her home but the entire street. Armed with a clipboard and an attitude that could rival a drill sergeant, she lived to enforce rules, even the ones she made up. And today she had a new target, the farmer who lived just outside the HOA's jurisdiction. He wasn't in the HOA. His land wasn't governed by their rules. But that didn't stop Karen. It started with a letter. Hand-delivered. A violation notice that looked official but, upon closer inspection, had clearly been printed at home. Dear resident, your property does not align with the aesthetic standards of this community. Please remove all unsightly structures, e.g., barns, tractors, and farm equipment, within 30 days. The farmer, a practical man who had lived on his land long before Karen ever set foot in the neighborhood, read the note, chuckled, and crumpled it up. He had real work to do. He wasn't about to let some suburban busybody tell him what to do on his own property. But Karen wasn't the type to take no for an answer. By the end of the week she was back, this time standing at the edge of his property, hands on her hips, glaring at his barn as if it had personally insulted her. You can't have that here, she declared. It ruins the look of the neighborhood. The farmer, leaning casually against his fence, raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, this ain't the neighborhood. This is my farm. Karen gasped as if he had just confessed to a crime. This entire area is part of our community. You need to comply with HOA regulations. He smiled, shook his head, and tipped his hat. I don't think so. And just like that, the battle lines were drawn. Karen wasn't used to being told no. In her mind, she was the law of the land, the final authority on all things suburban. The HOA was her kingdom, and every mailbox, flower bed, and driveway was supposed to bow to her will. But the farmer? He was an anomaly. A rebel. A man who dared to live outside the sacred HOA covenant. And to make things worse, he didn't even care. That was unacceptable. So she did what any self-righteous HOA tyrant would do, she escalated. The first offense, according to Karen's imaginary rulebook, was that eyesore of the farmer's barn. It was old, sturdy, and well-maintained, but to her, it was a blight upon the neighborhood's pristine aesthetic. She showed up with a clipboard and a forced, overly sweet smile. Sir, I've come to discuss the improvements you'll need to make to your property. The farmer barely looked up from fixing a fence post. Ain't making any. Karen's smile twitched. Well, according to HOA standards. I ain't in the HOA. She blinked as if trying to process a concept too foreign for her brain to grasp. But your property is so close to the neighborhood. It affects our home values. The farmer finally turned to face her, expression unreadable. That's so. Yes. Your barn, your tractors, your farm. It all disrupts the look we're trying to maintain. If you could just move some of this equipment somewhere less visible. Move my tractor? He scratched his chin, pretending to consider it. Sure, I'll just park it in my invisible barn right next to my invisible fields. Karen's eyes narrowed. You're being difficult. No, ma'am. I'm being reasonable. You, on the other hand, are trying to enforce rules that don't apply to me. That should have been the end of it. Any rational person would have realized they had no power over private property outside HOA boundaries and let it go. But Karen was no rational person. The next day, a letter appeared in the farmer's mailbox. Notice of violation. Your property does not comply with community standards. Failure to correct the following issues will result in fines. The list was absurd. Unauthorized structures, the barn. Improper vehicle storage, the tractor. Excessive noise, his rooster. Unapproved livestock, his cows on a farm. The farmer laughed. Then he tossed the letter into the fireplace and went about his day. But Karen wasn't done. A few days later she was back standing outside the property line with a tape measure, meticulously checking the grass height. "Ma'am," the farmer called from his porch, "you realize trespassing's illegal, right?" "I'm not trespassing," she snapped. "I'm inspecting." "Inspecting what?" "The unkempt state of your property." She gestured wildly at his land as if expecting him to be ashamed. He looked out over the sprawling acres of open fields, fresh hay bales stacked neatly, and horses grazing lazily in the distance. "Looks pretty kept to me," Karen huffed. "Well, it doesn't meet our standards." He folded his arms. "That's so?" "Yes. And if you refuse to comply, I'll be forced to escalate matters." "Escalate away," he said, tipping his hat before heading back inside. That night she took her complaints to the HOA board, ranting about how the farmer was damaging the property values and lowering the tone of the neighborhood. "I mean, it's practically a zoo over there," she fumed. "There are animals. And dirt." The board members exchanged uncertain glances. Some of them had their own grudges against the farmer, perhaps annoyed by the occasional scent of manure drifting in on the wind, but even they knew he wasn't technically under their jurisdiction. One of the more reasonable board members spoke up. "Karen, his land isn't in the HOA. We don't have the authority to." Karen slammed a binder onto the table. "But we should." She had spent the last 24 hours drafting a special annexation proposal to extend HOA rules beyond its current limits. The room fell silent. Even her allies shifted uncomfortably. "You want to force someone who didn't sign the HOA agreement to follow HOA rules?" one of them asked hesitantly. Karen nodded, looking far too pleased with herself. "Yes. That's not how it works," another board member pointed out. She scoffed. "It should be." They refused to entertain her idea. But Karen, she refused to accept their refusal. Her next move was to call city code enforcement, hoping to find something, anything, to use against the farmer. She reported his barn as an illegal structure. The inspector confirmed it was perfectly legal. She claimed his animals were a public nuisance. Animal control dismissed her complaint. She even tried to claim he was violating noise ordinances, except his farm was far enough from the houses that even the crowing rooster didn't count as an issue. Strike after strike. And each failure only made her more determined. By now, the farmer had caught on to the game and decided to have a little fun of his own. The next morning, Karen woke up to find a new addition to the farmer's property. A massive wooden sign, painted bright red, standing tall by the road. "Not in the HOA." Karen nearly choked on her morning coffee. The war had officially begun. Karen had made it her life's mission to bring the farmer under the iron grip of the HOA. But the farmer? He had work to do. Real work, not the kind that involved harassing neighbors over mailbox colors. At first he ignored her antics. He had seen people like Karen before. Folks with too much time and too little power, desperate to control anything they could. But when she kept escalating, he figured it was time to have a little fun of his own. The first thing he did was put up a second sign. The first one, "Not in the HOA," had already ruffled Karen's feathers, but this new one was even better. Painted in bold, clear letters it read, "Private property. Trespassers will be used as target practice." It was mostly a joke. Mostly. Karen, of course, was livid. She marched right up to his fence, hands on her hips, huffing like an enraged goose. "This is intimidation," she shrieked. "You're threatening your neighbors." The farmer, leaning against his porch railing, tipped his hat. "No, ma'am. Just reminding folks where they're welcome and where they ain't." Karen practically vibrated with rage. "That sign is aggressive and offensive. You need to take it down immediately." The farmer took a long sip from his coffee. "Nope." Karen turned bright red, sputtering in disbelief. "This is unacceptable. I'll call the authorities." "Already did," he said, holding up his phone. "Sheriff says it's perfectly legal." Karen let out an unintelligible screech and stormed off, heels clicking against the pavement like an angry tap dancer. That should have been the end of it. But Karen, she wasn't one to back down. A few days later she sent him another notice, this one claiming that his fence was not in compliance with HOA guidelines. The farmer nearly doubled over laughing. She's trying to regulate a fence that ain't even in the HOA? Still, he figured if Karen wanted a battle, she'd get one. That weekend he added something new to his fence. A row of pink plastic flamingos, each one wearing a tiny cowboy hat. And just for fun, a giant inflatable Santa Claus. In the middle of summer, Karen lost her mind. She stormed up the road, arms flailing as she pointed at the decorations. You cannot have that here. Sure I can, the farmer said, grinning. Ain't no HOA rules for my land. This is harassment, she shrieked. No ma'am. This is entertainment. By now the rest of the neighborhood had caught on. And while some folks tried to avoid the drama, others were loving every second of it. Tom from next door came by just to shake the farmer's hand. You, sir, are a legend. The old couple across the street put up their own flamingos in solidarity. Karen. She was one more incident away from combusting. That's when she took things to the next level. One morning, the farmer woke up to the sound of hammering. He stepped onto his porch and nearly dropped his coffee. Karen was at the edge of his property, pounding a wooden stake into the ground. Attached to it, a no farming zone sign. The farmer blinked. Lady, what the hell are you doing? Karen spun around, looking smug. This is an official HOA directive. He stared at her. For land not in the HO? It's a community protection effort, she said, crossing her arms. We can't allow disruptive activities like farming so close to our neighborhood. The farmer took a slow breath, nodding to himself. Then, without another word, he walked inside, grabbed his shovel and calmly walked back out. Karen barely had time to react before he dug up the sign and chucked it over the fence. I suggest you keep your trash off my land, he said, dusting off his hands. Karen gasped. You can't just. Sure I can. He pointed at the very clear private property sign. Karen's eyes twitched. You think this is funny? The farmer smirked. I know it is. She stormed off, muttering threats under her breath. At this point, the farmer figured she'd either give up or get herself into real trouble. Turns out she chose the second option. Word had spread fast. By now, everyone in the neighborhood knew about Karen's one-woman war against the farmer, and reactions were mixed. Some neighbors, particularly the ones who had suffered under Karen's HOA tyranny, were loving the show. Others, mostly the self-proclaimed proper suburbanites, whispered their support for her but weren't brave enough to get involved. And then there were the neutral parties, people who just wanted to sit back, drink their coffee, and enjoy the chaos like it was a primetime reality show. One afternoon, as the farmer was fixing a gate, his neighbor Tom wandered over, hands stuffed in his pockets, a smirk on his face. You know she's trying to start a petition, right? The farmer wiped his brow. Oh yeah. For what? Tom grinned. To force you into HOA compliance. The farmer chuckled. Ain't how that works. She's going door to door, Tom continued. Heard she told the Johnsons that your tractor was destroying the peaceful suburban atmosphere. The farmer snorted. It's a tractor. Tom nodded, clearly enjoying the absurdity. I also heard she told Old Man Henderson that your cows were a health hazard. The farmer raised an eyebrow. Did Henderson laugh in her face? Tom grinned. He sure did. That wasn't the only reaction Karen was getting. Some neighbors were starting to push back. Loudly. At a neighborhood barbecue, the topic inevitably came up. I'm just saying, Karen huffed to a small group of homeowners. He's right there, bringing down the quality of our neighborhood. Janet, a longtime resident and one of the few people unafraid of Karen, raised an eyebrow. You mean the man who minds his own business? Karen scoffed. He's running an actual farm next to our homes. It's disruptive. Janet took a slow sip of her drink. So, you knew he was there when you moved in? Karen's nostrils flared. That's not the point. The HOA exists to maintain standards and... Janet cut her off with a smirk. He's not in the HO, sweetheart. Nearby, someone chuckled. Karen's face turned red. Across the street, another neighbor, Bill, was recounting his own Karen horror story to the farmer. Last summer, Bill said between bites of his burger, she threatened to fine me 4 unauthorized garden gnomes. The farmer laughed. Garden gnomes? Bill nodded. Apparently they weren't in line with the community aesthetic. The farmer whistled. And what did you do? Bill grinned. Put out 10 more. The farmer tipped his hat. Respect. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't giving up. When the petition failed, because, shockingly, most people didn't want to force their neighbor into an HOA he never signed up for, she went to Plan B: intimidation. One evening, as the farmer was bringing his horses in for the night, he noticed something off. Karen was standing at the edge of his property again, arms crossed, glaring daggers at him. But this time she wasn't alone. 3 of her HOA loyalists were with her, nodding along as she ranted. "Something wrong, ma'am?" the farmer asked, leaning against the fence. Karen pointed at his barn. "We're here to formally demand that you remove this structure. It's an eyesore and—" The farmer held up a hand. "Stop right there." Karen blinked. "Excuse me." "First off," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this ain't an HOA meeting, and I sure as hell ain't taking demands on my own property." One of the HOA guys tried to speak up, but the farmer kept going. "Second, y'all are standing on my land right now." Karen glanced down at her feet, then quickly shuffled back an inch just outside the fence line. "That doesn't change the fact that—" The farmer smirked. "Third, and most importantly, you don't have a single ounce of authority here." The HOA crew murmured among themselves. One of them, clearly not as invested in Karen's crusade, looked around awkwardly and muttered, "Maybe we should go?" Karen ignored him. "This is not over," she snapped. The farmer chuckled. "Oh, I know." As the HOA loyalists retreated, Tom, who had been watching from his porch, called out, "How long you think she lasts before she does something really dumb?" The farmer sighed, shaking his head. "Probably sooner than we think." And he was absolutely right. The thing about people like Karen is that they don't know when to quit. Even when the entire neighborhood had made it clear that they didn't support her crusade, even when the farmer had shut down her every attempt at control, she still couldn't let it go. So she did what any entitled HOA dictator would do: she went nuclear. It started small. Karen began filing fake complaints about the farmer to every local agency she could think of. Zoning violations? Rejected. His farm had been there for decades, well before the HOA even existed. Health hazards? The inspector took one look at his well-maintained property and laughed. Noise complaints? The sheriff reminded her that living near a farm meant occasionally hearing farm noises. Strike after strike. And each failure only made her more desperate. One evening, as the farmer was finishing up his chores, he spotted something out of the corner of his eye. Karen standing in his field. Not near his property. Not outside the fence. But inside his fence, clutching a notepad, muttering to herself and measuring his grass with a ruler. The farmer exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. "This woman is out of her mind." "Ma'am," he called out, voice calm but firm. "I'm gonna need you to get off my land." Karen jumped, spinning around like a kid caught sneaking cookies. I'm just conducting an inspection." He took a slow step forward. "You're trespassing." She crossed her arms. "I have a right to ensure the community remains visually appealing." The farmer's patience had officially run out. "You got about 10 seconds to step off my property before I call the sheriff." Karen scoffed. "Go ahead. I'll tell them you're harassing me." So he did. Right in front of her. As soon as the sheriff picked up, Karen's face went pale. Without another word, she scrambled over the fence and speed-walked back toward her house. The sheriff showed up anyway, listened to the farmer's complaint, and then paid Karen a visit. Now, any normal person would have taken this as a wake-up call. But Karen, she doubled down. A week later, the farmer was in his yard when he heard it. The screech of tires followed by shouting. He turned just in time to see Karen standing in his driveway brandishing a gun. "You will comply with HOA regulations," she shrieked, waving the firearm around like a lunatic. The farmer didn't flinch. He didn't panic. He just calmly pulled out his phone and started recording. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady, "I'd rethink what you're doing right now." But Karen was beyond reason. "You've had every opportunity to fix this. But you refused to listen. I will make you follow the rules." At that moment, sirens wailed in the distance. Karen froze. The sheriff, who had already been keeping an eye on her after the trespassing incident, was pulling into the driveway. For the first time in her life, Karen was speechless. The farmer put his phone away and crossed his arms as the deputies got out of their vehicle. "Evening, officers. I believe we got ourselves an armed trespasser." Karen tried to backpedal, stuffing the gun into her purse. I was just trying to talk to him." The sheriff wasn't buying it. "Ma'am, you just threatened a man with a firearm." Karen spluttered, but there was no getting out of this one. Within minutes, she was in handcuffs, being led to the patrol car as neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains. By the time the sheriff drove off with Karen in the back seat, the farmer let out a deep breath. Well, he muttered, guess that settles that. But the fallout wasn't over yet. The neighborhood was buzzing. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, had finally gone too far. News of her armed tantrums spread like wildfire, and suddenly, even her most loyal HOA allies were pretending they had never met her. At the next HOA meeting, people barely waited for it to start before demanding answers. She pulled a gun on a neighbor? Someone asked, incredulous. She's been harassing that poor man for months, another added. Even the HOA board, who had tolerated Karen's antics for far too long, realized they had to act fast before their association became a complete joke. By unanimous vote, Karen was officially removed from the HOA board. And that wasn't the only consequence. See, Karen had spent years enforcing HOA rules on everyone else, nitpicking every minor violation. But while she was so busy policing others, she had ignored her own infractions. Turns out, Karen had broken several HOA regulations herself. Her fence, the wrong height. Her house color, unapproved. Her landscaping, out of compliance. And the best part? The very HOA she once ruled over with an iron fist fined her for every single violation. The farmer had a front row seat to her downfall. He happened to be sitting on his porch one morning when he saw an HOA inspector placing a bright yellow violation notice on Karen's door. He couldn't help but chuckle. A few days later, a for sale sign appeared in Karen's yard. Whether it was the humiliation, the fines, or the fact that no one in the neighborhood wanted to speak to her anymore, she had finally decided to leave. And the farmer? He celebrated the only way he knew how, by throwing a big barbecue for the neighbors who had secretly cheered him on the whole time. Tom from next door raised a beer. To freedom from tyranny. The farmer smirked. And to making sure the next HOA Karen knows better than to come after a man not in the HOA. The neighbors laughed. Across the street, the for sale sign wobbled in the breeze, a final reminder that for once karma had done its job. With Karen gone, life in the neighborhood felt different. Lighter, quieter, and far less ridiculous. No more surprise violation notices for absurd infractions. No more passive-aggressive emails about aesthetic harmony. No more HOA board meetings that felt like courtroom dramas over mailbox colors. For the farmer, it was just another day. The sun still rose, the animals still needed tending, and the land still thrived, just as it always had. But there was a new sense of peace in the air. One afternoon, as he was loading hay onto his truck, Tom strolled over, grinning. "You hear the latest?" Tom asked. The farmer wiped the sweat from his brow. "Depends. What's the latest?" "Karen's house sold." The farmer raised an eyebrow. "To who?" Tom smirked. "A family with 4 kids, 3 dogs, and an RV parked in the driveway." The farmer chuckled. "Bet Karen's somewhere foaming at the mouth." Tom laughed. "I like to think she can feel it. Like a disturbance in the force." As they stood there watching the neighborhood return to normal, a slow smile spread across the farmer's face. Things were finally the way they should be. No unnecessary rules. No clipboard-wielding tyrants. Just people living their lives, without someone trying to control every inch of it. And as a final touch, the farmer decided to leave one reminder of the battle he had won. That week he put up one last sign by his fence. In big bold letters it read, "Still not in the HOA. Just in case the next Karen needed a warning." What's the craziest thing an HOA has ever tried to enforce on you or someone you know? If you were the farmer, how would you have handled Karen's nonsense? Do you think HOAs should have the power to control properties outside their boundaries, or was Karen just power hungry? What's worse? Nosy HOA Karens or neighbors who ignore all rules completely? How would you have trolled Karen if she kept trying to enforce fake rules on you? Have you ever had a neighbor from hell? What did they do? If Karen were your HOA president, what's the first ridiculous rule she'd enforce? Do you think she learned her lesson in the end, or is she causing drama in a new neighborhood?